3,739 mobile applications are added to the Android store every day, with the current total at 17 million. $4.9 trillion worth of goods were sold via online retail just this year. The market of digital commerce is nearly infinite at this point, and it's not slowing down. With such a gargantuan number of choices available, how can consumers possibly choose where to spend their money? Digital designers have the monumental task of convincing users to select out their product over the cacophony of competition. As somebody with a master's degree in digital design, when I was faced with the challenge of going into an industry all about competition at a titanic scale, I chose to do something much easier, get a PhD in it instead. Many designers who have decided to take on the challenge believe that the best way to do this is not to give consumers the best choice, but to prevent them from making a choice at all by rushing them into purchases, hiding alternatives, and even shaming them into buying. These tricks are so prevalent, there's a special name for them: dark patterns. For a lot of users, dark patterns are an inconvenience or go completely unnoticed. Sure, they might buy a couple of things they may not have or accidentally subscribe to a service. But for neurodiverse users, these patterns can cause significant harm. Neurodiversity refers to a variation in the human brain regarding sociability, learning, attention, mood, and other mental functions. Folks who are more neurodiverse from the quote unquote normal brain we've been socialized to expect might be considered to have ADHD, autism, OCD, anxiety, dissociation, and more. Even though cognitive diversity is ubiquitous, these individuals are considered outside of the majority. As a result, a lot of designs and designers do not consider them at all, and dark patterns are no exception. Instead of buying a few extra things, somebody with ADHD might end up buying an entire set of products, regardless of if they're able to afford it. Or somebody with a gambling addiction might be triggered and have a relapse. Or in my case, I could get panic attacks when there's a countdown on a website for me to put in my credit card information. Dark patterns are defined as systemically used design techniques that result in negative experiences for users, which are against their best interests and likely to happen without their consent or awareness. Dark patterns generate value for the designer or product owner at the expense of the user's well-being. These could be getting users to spend more money, time, or attention than they meant to a harmful extent. It may seem like that it's a clear-cut issue. Dark patterns are bad and morally designers should not use them. The majority of the design community has, in fact, rejected the use of dark patterns as unethical and advocate publicly against them. But a huge sector of e-commerce websites and apps continue to use dark patterns. It is difficult to decide the difference between a design that is merely persuasive and when it becomes dark and manipulative. Many designers would argue that all good design is meant to be manipulative to the user a little bit, and design uses these things to try to get them to buy their specific product. Also, when deciding what counts as a dark pattern, the experience of neurodiverse users is rarely taken into account, so that gray area gets even more complicated. Designers create products to serve a socially constructed norm user. This means that users who are neurodiverse or have mental health challenges are not considered when designers are deciding if their product is ethical or not. They're seen as an insignificant minority, despite being more vulnerable to the psychological tricks used in dark patterns. Dark patterns work because of theories from behavioral psychology that have been used to sell things for a long time. But now digital design teams are hiring behavioral psychologists to their teams to learn the very best ways to hack brains through cognitive biases, which are assumptions that people make that are often incorrect. Cognitive biases are pretty universal for humans based on our cognitive evolution, but people who are neurodiverse may experience them differently. For example, people with anxiety have on average more active amygdalas, which is the part of the brain responsible for risk assessment and fear. That increased fear response can make people with anxiety more susceptible to fear-based cognitive biases, such as artificial scarcity, which makes things seem more valuable because they're rare, and loss aversion, being more affected by losses than by gaining an equivalent thing. Individuals with OCD may have disrupted ventromedial prefrontal cortices, a mouthful I know, which are vital in decision-making. As a result, they might be more vulnerable to biases that put extra pressure on the user's cognitive load or offer an easy way to quickly lighten the cognitive load, such as the status quo bias, accepting what is already pre-selected, or the bandwagon effect, selecting whatever is most popular. Now, remember that dark patterns are specifically designed to prey on our cognitive biases. Because people with cognitive differences can be more susceptible to cognitive biases, dark patterns can also be much more harmful. The use of cognitive biases and psychological tricks by designers is not new by any means. It comes from a long history of trying to figure out the best way to get people to spend money. When design as a tool for e-commerce first evolved, it borrowed a lot of techniques directly from marketing. By combining marketing techniques with behavioral psychology studies, major design agencies started using PET design, which stands for Persuasion, Emotion, and Trust Design. PET design is a toolkit of techniques which gently nudge consumers using psychology and cognitive science. Persuasion techniques are focused on triggering actions. Emotional design attempts to adjust the user's mood to favor the product. Finally, trust techniques make the product or interface seem more credible and reassure the user. Persuasive design started out as a tool to convince users to quit smoking or start an exercise habit. Good things. Now, however, it's used as a tool to mold our users' behaviors without their knowledge. While not all examples of persuasive design are insidious, as more psychological tricks are added into design, and when they are taken too far, they become dark patterns. Let's look at some examples of dark patterns in the context of lived experience with disability. Due to the additional level of vulnerability, dark patterns can become an issue of safety and security for these folks. Somebody with anxiety might have a significantly heightened experience of artificial scarcity. If a site is yelling at them to buy quickly before everything is gone, they might not just end up buying something they don't want, they might have lasting cognitive fatigue as well. Their threshold for design becomes a dark pattern because their threshold also might be lower than that for an average user. The design might have a negative experience for a user with anxiety well before it is for somebody without anxiety. Another dark pattern is that particularly effective on individuals with anxiety is timed interactions. This is common when a website has a promotion or a sale. The urgency associated with the countdown triggers that fear response again, inhibiting the user's decision-making. Confirm shaming is when the site tries to shame you into doing something, usually signing up for their mailing list. The decline option usually appears to be making some judgment about the user. Cosmo magazine has one which requires you to click on the message, "I'm boring." Some people might scoff at the clear pettiness of that message, but on a bad social anxiety day, that message can be hugely triggering. Or somebody with certain expressions of autism might take that message as literal instead of seeing it as unnecessarily aggressive. Lots of dark patterns just focus on making information as difficult as possible to understand. Trick questions use difficult language to prevent you from making informed decisions, since you don't understand the choice you're making. This can be really hard for people with language processing difficulties, or a site might use misdirection, which distracts you away from important information to trick you into accepting terms or extra costs. People who are easily overwhelmed or have difficulty reading instructions, such as folks with ADHD or anxiety, will fall for this trick much more frequently. Video games have their own types of dark patterns. The most famous one is loot boxes, when a player opens a randomized reward. This is essentially poorly disguised gambling. For folks who have gambling addictions, this is clearly a huge problem, but also for people with ADHD who might not be able to keep track of how many times they've opened a crate, or somebody with OCD who gets an obsession with completing a set of collectibles. Despite the significant safety risks and major consequences dark patterns have, shockingly little is being done about preventing them, and even less is being done to acknowledge the most vulnerable users. Disabled folks are systemically excluded from the design industry, both as users and designers, and therefore disabled perspectives or neurodiverse perspectives are starkly absent from the design board. The majority of solutions presented by dark pattern scholars for users to protect themselves is manipulation literacy. Manipulation literacy encourages users to educate themselves on dark patterns and learn to recognize them in the wild. Much like problematic historical views of disability, the onus of responsibility is placed on the individual and not on the system in place, which discriminates against the disabled folks. Making free and informed choices is a human right. Protection of safety is a human right. Creating interfaces that take advantage of cognitive heuristics that people with disabilities are particularly vulnerable to deny them those rights. Assuming that some amount of manipulation literacy will ensure users can make informed decisions is based on the constructive norm of user identities, which has been formed based on our privileged representation in the digital space. Due to neurological differences or differing experiences, neurodiverse people may not have sufficient supports through manipulation literacy to make choices freely and safely. In addition, able-bodied neurotypical designers are also not in a position to determine what patterns may result in negative experiences for users. Negative outcomes for the user can include infinite possibilities, and it only accentuates the privileged position researchers of dark patterns are in when they need not consider other potential forms of harm. For neurodiverse folks, consequences might differ significantly from the narrow defined capital losses currently dominating the dark pattern narrative. Some designers and companies might be concerned that if they were to stop using dark patterns, they would fall behind their competitors. Dark patterns are so prevalent that many of them are now just seen as best practice in the design industry. Design companies are hiring behavioral psychologists to their teams to help them learn how to best influence their users without their consent. So this problem is only going to get worse. In the rat race of trying to catch a user's attention, companies are just going to continue outdoing each other with more effective dark patterns for the sake of profit. New strategies are becoming developed all the time, and it's incredibly difficult to try to keep up to combat them. As a result, the consequences of dark patterns will only grow. More vulnerable populations will be harmed, and we will fall further and further behind in trying to do anything about it. As the digital world expands, it's vital that we make sure that it's a safe world for everyone. Legislation on manipulative designs like dark patterns is the only way, but definitions are loose, loopholes are plentiful, and it certainly does not take into account the experiences of disabled users. If you're a policymaker using this and watching this show, get on that. Elsewise, there's still a lot we can do to fight dark patterns. First, advocacy efforts in disability issues must start with centering disabled voices. A key tenet of the disability rights movement was nothing about us without us, which signifies no decision about the disabled folks' lives should be made without them. It's the responsibility of the designer to know their audience, and that includes disabled folks. Next, call out companies who are blatantly using dark patterns. There are several places which documented dark patterns in action. darkpatterns.org, darkpatterns.games, dark patterns for video games, r/asshole design on Reddit, and @darkpatterns on Twitter. Data privacy laws only came about because the general population got riled up about it. The same could be true of dark patterns. As the digital world expands, we need to be vocal about how we want it to look. Finally, if you're a designer or if you're involved with creating digital interfaces, think critically about your design choices and who is represented in your design space. Users should buy your product because it's a good product, not because you've tricked them into wanting it. Transparency and honesty are key, and always think about the human at the other end of your design. And consider the full spectrum of humans, not just who you think is a quote-unquote normal user. Design for the edges and ensure that you are creating a safe user environment for everyone. If possible, try to boost marginalized voices and create a safe space for neurodiverse folks to be a part of the design process. We live in an increasingly digital world with new design tricks and trends evolving at a rapid pace. As we move forward to that digital future, let's make sure that everybody can safely come along.